Kev, so I was hoping there'd be stairs on this side, but there aren't, so I'll have to go very carefully. I was very impressed with the way the minister got onto it, that's for sure. Dave June, Professor Dool, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for the opportunity to speak today about the history of AWMSG as someone who has been or was involved right from the beginning and have enjoyed the journey. In 1942, exactly 80 years ago, a young Scottish doctor was working in a prison camp in Germany, having been captured in the Battle of Crete a year earlier, treating Allied prisoners suffering from tuberculosis. He didn't know whether to do bed rest, to collapse the lung, to put air into the abdominal cavity, or whether to even remove some of the ribs in order to rest the lung, which was the only treatment thought to be effective at the time. And later on in his book, he alluded to this when he said, "I would willingly have sacrificed all my medical freedom for some hard evidence." And he feared that he may have shortened some of the lives of his patients as a result of that ignorance. And he credits himself at that time as being the spur to his subsequent career spent trying to improve evidence-based medicine. And in Effectiveness and Efficiency, which was the book he wrote in 1971, which was prophetic in its way, he said three things about medicines. First of all, he wanted to prevent the introduction of new drugs and therapeutic procedures unless they are more effective or equally effective and cheaper than existing therapies. I think we now take a much more facilitatory approach to that because the medicines we have are much more effective. He said that we should evaluate all existing therapies, accepting present constraints, and exclude those that were ineffective or too dangerous. And that was something that the Committee on Review of Medicines did in the 1980s and 90s. And the last chair of that Committee on Review of Medicines within the MHRA was David Lawson, who went on to found the Scottish Medicines Consortium and was an enormous benefit to us when he came to tell us of his experiences when AWMSG was being founded. And finally, Cochrane said we should determine the optimum place of treatment for those therapies about which there is any doubt. And that, of course, we now call medicines optimization. So I'd like to mention his principles of evidence, which were articulated by Järvinen about 10 years ago, and which were that when medicines are approved by the regulatory authorities, they're based on efficacy from randomized controlled trials. Cochrane felt that there should also be evidence in the real world, and he called this effectiveness, or we now call it clinical effectiveness. And finally, as we've heard already from both our speakers previously, it's crucial to have cost effectiveness as a criterion. He called that efficiency in the title of his book. And so AWMSG was fortunate that it was founded in 2002, at the time that evidence-based medicine had started to really have an impact, and when the health service in Wales had been devolved. What I think the concern was amongst many was that health professionals had never really thought about going off the first rung of the ladder onto to get a better view of what really was a priority in achieving the best outcomes for patients. And it was the first health minister, Jane Hutt, who set up that forum that the ministers told us about. Dr. Norman Mills was the chief executive of University Hospital Landock, who chaired the committee. And that report set up AWMSG with a very broad remit. a remit which at the time seemed almost unachievable with the resources that were available. I think I'd like to just make a smaller ladder, call it the step stool of strategy for AWMSG. This wasn't articulated at the time that AWMSG was established, but I think through experience, I think we've recognized that these were priorities which I think were very important in achieving anything, which was first of all to have transparency, proper transparency, defined in that way, to have timeliness. Parkinson's lesser known second law is that delay is the deadliest form of denial, and that it's important to have promptness and timeliness. And then finally, I think the third, sometimes underestimated criterion is teamwork. And it's a tribute to AWMSG to see so many people from all over Wales who've contributed to AWMSG and its subgroups. And that really, I think, is the key to the last 20 years. Because, as we've heard already, and we'll hear again, together we're stronger. So briefly, I'd just like to mention about medicines access in Wales, about medicines optimisation in Wales. And I forgot to put the question mark on this, because this is up to you in the room what the way forward is. But I point to a way forward that I think may be worth considering, and which I know you're already looking at. Now, if we go back 20 years to 2002, it was fortunate that NICE had already started working in 1998. I think it was the first appraisal. And so it was clear that we didn't want to reinvent the wheel in Wales. And so AWMSG was formed to look at those medicines that were not on the NICE work programme. And at that time, I think the minister in the UK had, in England, had decided that drugs for rare diseases would not be part of NICE's agenda. And so we were disproportionately responsible for a lot of those medicines, very difficult decisions, which I see several of you around the table were involved in looking at. And then finally, you can't look at medicines access without thinking about the patients who fall through those, through the net. And those are the patients who require the opportunity to have an independent funding request. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So what about teamwork? The important thing was that the AWMSG would complement the work of NICE, and NICE were extremely supportive, and we put forward the processes of AWMSG for NICE's independent scrutiny, and they were accredited as being fair processes. I've already mentioned the importance of the geographic, professional and lay representation, so that every voice could be heard, including that of the industry. Timeliness was also important, and that was achieved, like in Scotland, with an initial industry submission, which was then critiqued in a one-step process rather than the two-step process that NICE had adopted, so that the HTA process was more rapid. And then you've already heard about the formulary acceptance, because there's one thing to approve a medicine or not to approve a medicine, but it's important that if it's approved, it's available. And then transparency was a linchpin of the processes. I'd like to think that AWMSG should have some credit for the transparency, but I think the transparency has to be attributed to Jane Hutt. Jane Hutt said, "You will meet in public and there are no ifs, ands or buts." And I think that was the best thing that ever happened, although at the time we all sat there challenged at the idea, never having been at a meeting which met in public. And I think it was salutary, but also very valuable, because after that challenge, the first meeting was in public and has been since. Scotland and subsequently NICE adopted the same process. And it resulted in all of the process issues being open, and therefore many of the appeals that had been around process disappeared, because did you look at this paper? Well, yes, that you were at the meeting and you could hear that that paper was discussed. So what impact did that have on health technology assessment? This paper describes that, and it looked at 171 single technology appraisals. There was a close alignment between the three bodies in the United Kingdom, but a very close alignment in terms of the decision, which was made independently. But because of the processes, the median time advantage gained in Wales was significant, an average of about 11 months, with a significant range. And again, I think that has informed the processes elsewhere. So timeliness was very important. The third process I mentioned was the individual patient funding process. The IPFR process was centralized in 2014-15. At that time, up to that time, an exceptionality requirement was in force, which meant that this was interpreted by health professionals as being one or two patients, and once one or two patients had been exceeded, then it could no longer be exceptionality. And the external review suggested that we ought to look at the likelihood of significant benefit and reasonable value for money using the same principles of effectiveness and efficiency. This was extremely helpful, and I'll show the impact of that subsequently. But it also allowed Wales to develop a One Wales interim commissioning process to pick up those medicines that fell through the criteria for acceptance for either NICE or AWMSG. And those were introduced in May 2016. I think you can see that as a result of that, the approvals, the total IPFRs for medicines, fell by over half. That's in the green in the bars. And those are the times at which that happened. And then the percentages of those which were approved rose from about 60% to 75% in the light of the change in the criteria. I won't go through this new treatment fund because I think the Minister's mentioned it, but a significant drop in the time lag between the approval process and acceptance on the formularies of the health boards in Wales. So timeliness was the criterion. AWMSG wasn't just all about health technology appraisal, important though that is. Medicines optimization was an important component, and if anything has become more important 20 years later than it was at the beginning. And that medicines optimization process involves a change in the way patients are supported to get the best possible outcomes. This is just a timeline of some of the issues chosen fairly arbitrarily, but I'd like to highlight briefly three. First, the quality safety indicators for prescribing, which allowed a benchmark across the health boards and with other parts of the UK. Those first quality, and then I'll mention briefly the Investor Save strategy, and then finally the National Inpatient Prescribing Chart. The National Prescribing Indicators were set up early in the life of AWMSG as a way of having a quantitative measure of prescribing. They're a blunt tool, but nevertheless tell you something about prescribing, though they don't tell you necessarily the drivers that are affecting that, and they can be used with associated targets to monitor that. So in 2003, AWMSG chose 3 NPIs, that they're called, National Prescribing Indicators. One was about generic prescribing as a percent of the total. One was about quality and safety of prescribing, 2 of them about antibiotics and hypnotics and tranquilizers. On the basis that medication errors can be reduced if all doctors use the same approved name for prescribing a medicine, although obviously now that doctors is all prescribers, because pharmacists, nurses, and other health professionals are prescribers. The impact of that was to result in Wales moving from being the lowest generic prescribers in the UK to being the highest. And that simple change resulted in millions of pounds being available for new medicines, which might be more effective. And that was maintained subsequently at the same levels as the rest of the United Kingdom. Now, that was a fairly simple approach with tables showing where health boards lay, with information and educational resources, but also with prescribing support software, which helped in the prescribing of generic medicines. So it suggested NPIs, National Prescribing Indicators, were useful benchmarks, and they were used in an Invest to Save initiative in 2012, where hypnotics and anxiolytics, non-steroidals, and proton pump inhibitors were identified, some for economic, but also in many circumstances for safety indicators, particularly in relation to hypnotics and anxiolytics, and also in non-steroidals, which there was evidence for overprescribing of. That Invest to Save, where Welsh Government put in funding, resulted in a savings to the health service of around about 6 million, which was about a 10-fold return on the investment, which I think persuaded Welsh Government to invest in the Welsh Analytical Prescribing Unit within the All Wales Therapeutics and Toxicology Centre, so that we could get the data on a real-time basis in order to inform future choices. I'll only mention the single national chart because I think the credit must go to the chief pharmacists in Wales, who got together and within 6 months developed a single national chart, so that anyone training or working in Wales was familiar with the same chart, had training opportunities in that chart, and had an e-learning package. In Australia, when it was introduced several years later, I think it was a year later, there was a 30% reduction in prescribing errors associated with it. So an important safety issue, because familiarity does help to improve safety. The next 10 years went very quickly, but I'll just pick up on 2 issues. First of all, the first All Wales Prescribing Indicator for biosimilar medicines, and secondly, one can't ignore the COVID pandemic, which had a major impact on the delivery of medicines to patients. So first of all, biosimilars. A national prescribing indicator was developed for biosimilars, with biosimilar prescribed as a percentage of the total reference product being used as the benchmark. Health boards were given information on why it was chosen, how implementation could occur, with quarterly feedback on performance, a best practice day in 2017, and a national biosimilars best practice day, where colleagues in England as well as Wales shared what worked elsewhere. And that was associated with significant improvement in the use of biosimilar medicines over a short period. Again, freeing up resources for medicines that could be used to obtain good outcomes. The COVID Therapeutic Hub was developed during COVID, at the request of Welsh Government, giving information on medicines for COVID-19, having a one-stop shop where authoritative evidence could be achieved, acting as a signpost to other resources, ensuring access to critical end-of-life medicines and links to resources elsewhere. And these are just some of the pages that you can see on that website that's still there now. For instance, All Wales Medicines advice about the NICE rapid guidelines, which were very important, and also the importance of yellow cards reporting during COVID-19. If Cochrane had developed his own ladder, I suspect he might have put equity in engagement and made the ladder a bit taller, an extra 2 rungs. And I think we've heard from the Minister about the importance of equity in Wales. Cochrane, though he never actually used the word equity in his books, he mentions in the introduction to Effectiveness and Efficiency, have a one-person poster at a rally in the streets of London saying, all effective medicines should be free. He didn't say who would pay for them, and he didn't say how you designated effectiveness, and he said he stood there for half an hour and then left. But on the other hand, it showed that he was very, very committed to equity, so that everyone, no matter their ability to pay, should have access to the medicines that were best for their condition. And he also was committed to engagement. Of course, equity is an issue because we have variability in the health indicators. This is the Welsh Index of Deprivation, and you can see the disparities across Wales in that. And of course, we are also, as a nation, proud to recognise the work of Julian Tudor Hart, who articulated the inverse care law, that the availability of good medical care tends to vary inversely with the needs of the population, and that is a dilemma that faces not just Wales but other nations as well. So Welsh Government decided in the footsteps of Bevan to freeze, then over a period of time, about 3 years, gradually reduce the cost of prescriptions so that the prescription charges were removed completely in 2007. Interestingly, the impact of that was really to have no change in the effect on the increase in medicines, because medicines were increasing, although they've levelled off more recently, as you can see, medicine costs. In Northern Ireland, the Welsh Government said that the impact was only, £3 million greater than in 2007. And Northern Ireland followed suit, and then Scotland. And some work in Scotland indicated that this had been associated with improved benefits in relation to availability for some of the long-term conditions, such as diabetes, asthma, and Crohn's disease. So that's one change that I think illustrates the importance of equity, so that people were able to access medicines irrespective of their financial circumstances. Archie Cochrane was also really committed to engagement. He spent a lot of time in Rhondda Farc, the Little Rhondda, trying to improve the screening for pneumoconiosis, tuberculosis, the combination of which could produce a devastating condition called progressive massive fibrosis. And he had questionnaires for which he got 90% returns, an amazing achievement in epidemiology, because he engaged, and engagement is crucial. In terms of AWMSG, engagement's been sought by having patient support groups to be giving evidence at the health technology appraisal, to have a clinician and patient interest group which looks at those medicines for rare diseases which have not been approved, to look to see whether the patient perspective has been adequately addressed. There's a more generic role for the patient and public interest group to look at strategic issues around the patient voice. AWMSG gave evidence at the first citizens' jury in Wales on aspirin, whether aspirin should be used for primary prevention of heart disease. And at the second citizens' jury, which was supported by the funding from AWMSG, the antibiotics in the community were examined by a group of 12 individuals who tried to reflect the views of their compatriots in the community. And AWMSG, AWTTC has worked with Healthwise Wales, one on views about patients' involvement in health technology appraisal in Wales, and one on yellow card reporting, patient reporting of yellow cards, which Dame June may speak about later. And finally, I think it's been really important that AWMSG has tried to have, and we'll hear from Richard Torbett from ABPI on his perspective, engagement with those people who produce the medicines which give patients better outcomes. So I think engagement is an important step of the ladder. Well, what's the way forward? Well, I take it really from this programme, because I think this programme highlights several of the issues that we need to look at. The way forward may be, first of all, and I know they definitely are, an issue to try and develop innovative approaches to access to medicines. And I'm sure we'll hear about that later in the day. Regenerative medicine, cell and gene therapies are important. Medication safety and pharmacovigilance is absolutely vital. Prudent and value-based healthcare is something that Wales has already taken the journey on, and Sally Lewis is spearheading that in Wales. We'll be hearing from Dyfrig Hughes later about pharmacogenomics and precision medicine, which really is an exciting potential future for medicines in the UK and worldwide. And then Sophie Howe will be telling us about the decarbonation strategic delivery plan that was alluded to by the Minister. So there's lots to do. There may be other priorities. Having no longer being involved, it's fascinating to see the work that's happening within AWMSG. And then finally, that step stool of strategy that I invented for AWMSG. Unfortunately, I didn't build it because it wouldn't have stood. But that step stool is important, and on the top rung of the ladder was teamwork. And I'd just like to mention the people who I think will have made AWMSG able to continue its work programme. First of all, the general public. If I've missed anyone from that group, please let me know. I think I'd just briefly mention some of the people from outside of Wales who have come today but have been really important to the work of AWMSG. I've already mentioned Richard Torbett and the ABPI, which has a representation in Wales and is heavily involved in that engagement, and the Welsh Industries Group. Welsh Government has been vital in steering the course of medicines programme in Wales, and we're grateful to Andrew Evans and his team. I think the outside body that I'd just like briefly to mention are, first of all, the MHRA, and we'll be hearing from Dame June about the work that MHRA is doing to improve the safe use of medicines for patients. The National Institutes for Health and Care Excellence, and we'll be hearing from Minded Boyson. I think we've also got Carl Boswell here, and we're grateful to them for the 20 years of dialogue that we've had with them. Scottish Medicines Consortium has been an important partner because they've gone through the same journey, and today we've got the new incoming chair of Scottish Medicines Consortium, Scott Muir here, Anne Lee, who has now recently retired, but for many years liaised over the principles, and we learned from each other. And then Pauline Maguire, I'm really grateful to them for attending today. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that this has illustrated that for the last 20 years, AWMSG has sought to build upon the foundations of effectiveness and efficiency articulated in the 70s by Archie Cochrane, a man before his time, with timely and equitable processes for engaging the public and patients in the processes. Transparency, hopefully, has been important, and timeliness and teamwork have been essential in achieving the safe, effective, and efficient use of medicines. But this is a continuing process, and those of you in the room still involved in, will be keen to ensure that we try to achieve Nye Bevan's goal, which he mentioned in his autobiography, that as a result of the National Health Service, the use of improved technologies and new discoveries are immediately generalised. We've still got some work to do. Thanks very much indeed.